Hello, welcome again to Sports Unlocked, going through all the week's sports news. With me, Rob Harris from Sky News, Martyn Ziegler from The Times, and Tariq Panja from The New York Times. Coming up, the potential departure from PSG, the departure from FIFA, news from the Premier League's annual meeting. But first, we start at the Champions League final in Istanbul. Manchester City's win over Inter Milan, the treble, Sheikh Mansour, the ruler of the UAE there as well. What an occasion.
You were there, weren't you, Rob? It'd be interesting to hear your reflections on lots of things around that. Apart from the people who were there, how the organisation went, because obviously there were some reports of sort of some fairly chaotic travel issues. But yeah, the fact Sheikh Mansour, I think Tariq was it 20? When was the last time he went to a Man City match? A long time ago.
I think the last time and the only time Sheikh Mansour went to a Man City game was a couple of weeks after he bought the club, which was in 2008, September, a home game, an evening game against Liverpool at Eastlands, now called Etihad Stadium, which Manchester City won 3-0. It's taken him obviously more than a decade to go there, and he picked the right game, and he had his brother alongside him, the Emir, the ruler of the UAE, Mohammed bin Zayed. And of course, Man City have always made clear, and we should make clear here as well, that the club is a private investment of His Highness Sheikh Mansour bin Zayed Al Nahyan and is not a state entity, just so we're clear on that.
But many state-related sponsors.
Many, yeah. I mean, we'll run out of time to go through them all, but yeah, many's probably the right word.
I mean, Sheikh Mansour is also the head of the Sovereign Wealth Fund, I think, isn't he? Whichever way you look at it, I think most people would think that this is a state-owned club.
Look, from my point of view, just the optics of that situation, and it wasn't just those two, the two brothers who kind of run the UAE. It was the rest of the dignitaries as well around them. There were senior figures from the UAE. So in all seriousness, we had a situation where a team from the north of England playing in the European Cup final is owned by and kind of overseen by a nation state thousands of kilometers away. And there it was in plain sight. For anyone who thinks where football is and where it's going, I think the juxtaposition of those two things and the images of the rulers of the UAE, and then the social media posts from people related to that country celebrating Manchester City's victory is a great day for their country. I think, whichever way you slice it, tells you that these teams are, at least in some way, used as a platform for the needs and whatever optics those countries want from football.
One piece I did see was, Martyn, by your colleague Owen Slot in The Times, pointing out there was little enthusiasm seemingly on the streets of Abu Dhabi after winning the Champions League. You could, I suppose, interpret it the other way, that it shows it's not an Abu Dhabi enterprise. In fact, people didn't really care there as much, and it was more about Manchester City themselves back at home.
For the fans, Rob, probably, yeah. But again, in terms of outward optics, what's bigger for advertising, if you want, in this case, advertising a brand, and the brand here is the UAE, to the world, than winning the biggest game in club football with all your insignia around it, your Emir in the stadium and all those sponsors you just mentioned?
It was a good piece by Owen Slot, actually, because he went to Abu Dhabi for the final. But one of the interesting things he found was that E8, the cable company or the broadcasting company, used to be known as Etisalat, has basically stopped taking beIN Sport. So actually most people couldn't watch it anyway. So that might reflect one reason why there wasn't particular enthusiasm, because they just couldn't even watch it. Another one of these very strange anti-Qatar things. I mean, UAE and Qatar are sort of at loggerheads, aren't they? So that might explain that too.
They could have had a word in the director's box, as the owner of beIN Sports, Nasser Al-Khalifi, was there.
Of course, a man with multiple hats. And that's Rob. That's 1-0 to the UAE in that sense. Their club has won the Champions League before Qatar's team, Paris Saint-Germain, right?
Well, absolutely. And they've only reached one final, Paris Saint-Germain, as well, too, back in 2020. Now, who was it from the UEFA Exco who was sitting, it seemed, on the pitches directly behind Sheikh Mansour?
I think it was Laura McAllister, right, Martyn?
Friend of the pod. Friend of the pod, yeah. If you're listening, Laura, we saw you there. And you are now, of course, a UEFA Vice President, the first female UEFA Vice President. So only right that she should be there. Just talk us through a bit around the organisation around the final.
Yeah, well, the stadium, the Ataturk, was about 20 odd miles from outside the centre, largely accessible by road. There was a metro, but I think it was actually only the Inter Milan fans who were sort of directed towards that. So Manchester City fans had to take the road. Our own experience just using standard taxis, we were dropped off over a mile away from the stadium. It could well have been actually didn't want to get stuck in traffic. So we ended up walking down the final mile or so to the stadium, which was hot, but fine, just walking down the pavement. It was pretty intense heat and everything was, struggling in terms of the traffic. And then, we were noticing some of the arrivals to the stadium, and Alexander Sheffer, the UEFA president, and other members of the UEFA leadership, they arrived about, an hour and 45, I think, before kickoff, which seems maybe later than usual. The Manchester City team only arrived 90 minutes or so before kickoff too.
Yeah, the City team, I think, was snarled up in that traffic as well. And look, this is the second time that stadium has hosted the Champions League final, hosted the AC Milan-Liverpool game in 2005. So, more than a decade ago, almost 2 decades ago now, and exactly the same fiasco with the traffic there and people being stuck on buses and having to walk across that moonscape. Especially with UEFA under so much scrutiny over how it stages these finals in recent years, this really shouldn't have happened yet again and again. And now fans are being asked to sort of write in and explain, the circumstances they found themselves in at a European final for the second year running, Rob.
And the biggest problem seemed to be post-match. So leaving the stadium area more than 90 minutes after the game. So you think a lot of the Inter Milan fans have left at this point. There are sort of passageways going to various fan buses, it seems. There isn't clear direction. There aren't people sort of with megaphones directing people clearly. And we end up actually by the side of the dual carriageway, which is absolutely chock-a-block with traffic. You're left attempting trying to flag down taxis down the side of the road without a clear way of getting out. So, quite potentially dangerous if you are left sort of staggering down the side of the road. And, we were just sort of experiencing, the fans would be experiencing it trying to leave.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously, when we go to these events, we're there for work, and it's not, for a lot of people, it's like the biggest event of their lives in many cases. I think that should bring them the most joy if their team wins. And that experience, it really does get ruined and becomes a nightmare in some cases for those Man City fans who are celebrating winning the treble, having to walk down the dual carriageway. And then not only that, Rob, I was seeing reports of fans being gouged 10, 15 times the usual price for a taxi, up to €300 for a taxi that should cost €15. It really shouldn't be happening, should it?
No, obviously a captive market for those taxis to profit from that moment. And it was all fine in the city centre. It's a huge city. What was it, 16 million population? So it could very easily cope with the influx of fans, unlike previous Champions League host cities where there's been challenges with accommodation. Obviously, the geography of the place, meaning the stadium is far out. The Besiktas Stadium actually is right in the centre, actually virtually next to the UEFA main hotel. But I suppose it does raise questions about Turkey's bid for Euro 2028 or Euro 2032, with UK and Ireland the opponent for 28, Italy the opponent for 32, obviously only going for one of them.
Yeah, that won't have helped for sure. I think it's always a difficult one, isn't it, with dealing with the fans. I mean, I remember going to Berlin in 2015, I think it was, for the Champions League final, and just getting away from there afterwards was I think it was like 2 hours before I was able to get a metro train back because it was so delayed. So it's one of these ongoing things that I think I'm amazed that people don't. It's not better organised. I really am, and I think you can say if you're looking at comparing England, the UK and Ireland, Wembley and the Ataturk Stadium for 2028, definitely Wembley. It's a lot easier, isn't it, to get to where you're going on public transport.
Although after the Euro 2020 final played in 2021, it was difficult getting away from the stadium, even long after the trophy presentation. I think the tube must have stopped by that point. It was hard to get taxis. That was a Sunday night, so a particularly difficult case. If you're dealing with a Saturday night game, the tubes can run later, but you would have a Euros final again on a Sunday night. So even Wembley in London could struggle as well.
Well, we're going to see that next year, aren't we? I think the Champions League final next season is at Wembley Stadium in London. So, we might have this dry run, as it were.
Although that's a Saturday night, so you've got the tubes running later, which should help. And I suppose it comes.
Yeah. But for UEFA, it's been another summer of difficulties with all three of its finals. We've been talking about that on the pod. We kind of predicted it. Unfortunately, we have been proven to be correct. So we had the Europa League final, Sevilla against Roma. We talked about those people who were just sort of barging through the turnstiles 2 or 3 at a time with one ticket. The pitch invasion in that game. There was the issue for West Ham fans of that tiny stadium in Czech Republic.
Having been there on the scene, it was largely fine. The organisation was just too small in terms of all the West Ham fans who wanted to go to the game.
Yeah, but 2 pitch invasions in 2 European finals as well, Rob. Obviously it's nice and it's really exciting to see your team win, but you surely are able to secure, fields. We had issues of pitch invasions here where we've had players being thumped by supporters. That really shouldn't be happening. And then we've just described this fiasco in terms of travel in Istanbul. These are supposed to be great moments for supporters, and they shouldn't be ruined.
I mean, I think if you're a local organiser putting on these big events, you've got to have a better plan than for getting people to and from the stadium.
Not the best experience for fans. Well, for Manchester City, it was going on to an all-night party. And I suppose one of the things in the whole fallout from the victory, something we've discussed before, is how much to mention all the factors. The Premier League charges, some pushback from members of the public on social media when people are calling it things like a fairy tale and not highlighting the charges. How much to mention UAE issues as well.
I think you've got to mention the charges. I mean, because it's the sort of, it's the elephant in the room. And if if you have a situation, you've got 115 charges hanging over your head, the outcome of which means you could even be expelled from the Premier League because they're so serious, and all your directors will have to resign, and all that sort of thing. If it's proved, then it's a huge issue. And I know that no one's saying that the charges of the financial reporting doesn't relate to the previous 5 years from now, but it's still that we still have not cooperating with the investigation over recent years. So I mean, I think you have to mention it.
Yeah, I mean that is the kind of fundamental basis of a lot of what this club is. There's enormous resource that has been pumped into this one team in Northern England after it was picked to be bought by the people of the United Arab Emirates. In a sense, it could have been anyone and anywhere, right? And they built this infrastructure. And I must say, to credit to them, unlike Paris Saint-Germain, there has been a very, very deliberate plan, and it's been executed extremely well as the choice of Pep Guardiola. And, he will go down as one of the geniuses in football management in the way he's changed the game through his tactics and coaching and etc. And these talented players they've got. The players still have to go on the field and play football, and they've played football really well. But, you can't not look at that all in isolation and without this other stuff that we've been talking about.
And that comes down to the heart of it. Both Paris Saint-Germain and Manchester City have spent a lot of money, but it seems actually Manchester City has managed to get the structures in place, the organisation, behind the scenes, the coaching stability as well, which is why so often we're talking about chaos at Paris Saint-Germain, and again this week with the future of Kylian Mbappe.
Yes, but just before we go into that, in terms of the UEFA charges and this elephant in the room, let's not forget PSG has the same elephant in the room. They've just not been. They've managed to kind of skirt that. The French league isn't looking at PSG. The French league doesn't have the same rules as the Premier League in terms of the financial fair play regulations. Both clubs, you could argue, were extremely lucky to get around the UEFA regulations. Both required CAS, the Court of Arbitration for Sport, and got away on a technicality. I remember writing a piece on PSG and how it got away with it, with the head of the chamber, the adjudicatory chamber, the judge essentially furious with what the investigators did and sent the report back to them and said, do this again. What your findings completely belie what the evidence suggests. And again, it was a time bar issue that got PSG off the case. So if you're Man City and are like seen as this club that has breached all these regulations on your own, you'd be like thinking, hang on, what about those guys? And I think they might be justified. But on to Mbappe, a player, Rob, who typifies all of that spending, I guess.
And if we look back to that deal that originally was done with Monaco to actually get him to Paris Saint-Germain as well, it was first of all a loan, then converted into a permanent deal too.
Yeah, remains the most second most expensive player in the world after the other player PSG signed the year they got him on loan in 2017, Neymar. 222 million euros for Neymar, 180 odd million euros for Kylian Mbappe. I mean, these are numbers that we struggle to get to still 5, 6, 7 years on.
And the fact is, there's this public war of words with Paris Saint-Germain and one of their star players.
Yeah, that doesn't look good, does it? I mean, the whole thing's a bit strange in that he signed this 3-year deal or 2-year deal with the option of a third year in May 2021. From PSG's, they're saying that his people have been involved in talks over renewing for that extra year. He's saying he has always made it clear that he was only ever going to sign for 2 years, and that although he's happy to play next year, then that's going to be it. PSG won't go for that because that would mean losing out on a transfer fee for him because he would leave as a free agent. But this letter he sent this week, slightly strangely, sort of when I saw a copy, I noticed it had been written on July the 15th last year, which is only sent now, 11 months later.
Maybe it was in junk mail.
Yeah, my God. But it's interesting that date as well. And you see kind of a lot of finessing in the public statements now. So it took 24 hours for the Mbappe and this group that's called Mbappe and his entourage that gave the statement to the Agence France Presse news agency in France. And that date that you mentioned is quite critical. And it's almost like let's try and make sense of everything. It was still quite hard to. So that date, 15th of July 2022, becomes really important. It is the date on the letter, but it's also a date when Mbappe and his entourage say they informed PSG orally that he would not take up the extension of the third year. That's also really strange because just 7 weeks earlier, he signed the new contract. The new season hadn't even started, and he'd already decided he's not going to take the third year. PSG had gotten a new coach and new backroom staff, new sporting director in Campos. It's all been really strange. And then the letter being leaked to L'Equipe, the French newspaper first, it seems, before it arrived at PSG. What do you make of the circus in terms of the leaking and it being made public so quickly? Who does that even benefit?
Well, I suppose it's whether if it's a tactic to get a new deal. Probably not. I don't think. I think it's saying either you sell me now, probably to Real Madrid because that's where he wants to go, or I leave on a free transfer. And I think he probably knows, or his entourage know that PSG won't want to do that. So I think this is more likely a way of forcing a move rather than trying to get a bigger deal because he's seen how much Benzema is getting from Saudi Arabia or something like that. I think he's probably thinks his time at PSG has come, even though he is insisting he's happy to stay there for another year.
And if you're seeing they can't win the Champions League, even with the cycle of players that they've had now, how many years will it take? And there's only so many times you can win the French league, so it might need that sort of heavy-handed ways to actually get a way out as well. And maybe at the same time, in some way, trying to nudge the fans against the club, making it seem like in some way that he just has to leave.
Yeah, and those fans are quite ferocious at times, aren't they? We saw this season already. Lionel Messi being booed and jeered for the last 6 months. This is, Messi, most famous, perhaps best player to play the game, being booed and jeered out of Paris, and he didn't get the worst of it. We had Neymar, the Brazilian, with fans camped out of his house chanting for him to go. We've had other players being targeted by those supporters as well, and it's very hard to see how Mbappe, who said, "Yeah, I don't want to be here in 2 years, but I'll be here next year." Like, if you're a supporter, this guy doesn't really want to be there. And we've described these guys. It's going to be quite an awkward year, an awkward relationship. PSG is still holding out hope, though, that despite all of this, despite them putting out differing narratives, almost one accusing the other of lying, PSG seems to suggest they've been in negotiations with Mbappe over an extended contract and then Mbappe saying he hadn't, coming up with a new long-term deal. I suppose football being what it is, things are forgotten quickly once contracts are signed, but it's very hard to see that, isn't it?
Everything does point to him wanting to find a new challenge elsewhere, and really the Qatar PSG project is struggling to deliver its fulfillment in the way Manchester City's has with the Champions League title. So much comes down to spending, and back in the Premier League, some new rules around wages, some new rules around actually the ability to bring in foreign players. So actually it'd be even easier to bring in less experienced foreign players.
Yeah, I think we mentioned this before, didn't we? And a proposal which the FA, the English FA, had put forward, which has now been approved by the Home Office. And I think it's really significant, actually, and especially for lower league clubs and the way the whole transfer system operates. So you can now, every club in the EFL and the Premier League can sign 2 overseas players from anywhere in the world, and they don't have to have the usual work permit points. So if there's a promising 18-year-old, never been capped, at a small club, he can be signed by anybody from Wrexham through to Manchester City, and they so you can have 2 players in your squad like that. You can have extra players in the Championship and the Premier League. You can have up to 4 players if you give enough playing time to English qualified players. So 35% of English qualified players having playing time in the Premier League or the Championship can get you another 2. So I've spoken to a couple of clubs, actually, both in the EFL, who are really quite sort of thinking this could be a game changer, and they're having been scouring the lower leagues for talent, unproven talent. Now they're going to the world is their oyster.
Those extra 2 players, the 4, will it be so for this summer? Will they backdate that to? How will they know if 35% of the playing time has been used by English players for this summer? Will it be
from last season? From last season, yeah.
Okay, and we also spoke, guys, to Paul Barber, if you remember, at the Sports Pro conference about this a couple of months ago. That's the Brighton chief executive, and he said one of the reasons they really want this is because they end up overpaying for players that they could get now. Someone who they've got their eye on, but they don't meet the criteria because they might be too young and don't have enough caps, or their scouting is so good and other people haven't quite spotted them. But they end up having to pay a lot more, and that money that they're saving could be used to go into developing English players. Do you think that's exactly what's going to happen with that money? Will all that money saved by buying these players comparatively cheaply go into funding more English players, youth systems? Is that going to happen?
Isn't this effectively like wider society 7 years on from Brexit, still trying to determine the rules of exit in the EU? And in this case, Premier League clubs hoping always to maintain the status quo before Brexit and eventually sort of winding its way back to that with almost free movement, but not only free movement from Europe, but almost seemingly whoever you want from the rest of the world too within these numbers, which now the parameters have been set over time could just grow and grow, couldn't it, to be increase the number of players who don't meet the effectively the visa requirements to be able to come to play in the Premier League.
It depends on the Home Office, doesn't it? But football seems to be a game of money, doesn't it? These days, transfer fees, transfer wages, etc. So just going back to that Brighton point, someone like Caicedo wouldn't have been able. Actually, he's Ecuadorian, but the people they bought in from France and the EU, they wouldn't have been able to get them here. Now they can, 2, and as Martyn says, up to 4. Potentially, that's tens of millions of pounds or euros for each club. But the point stands: what will this money be used for? Is the money they're going to save?
Yeah, I think I think they're hoping to spend less money. So we've seen record transfer windows, haven't we, from the Premier League? And I think the hope is that they will basically give less to their European rivals, because at the moment they feel slightly hamstrung the fact that they can only, if they want to buy an overseas player, he has to be an established star, but by and large.
That said, they can afford it. I mean, we just saw the data this week. The Premier League's revenues are double that of the next biggest league. So even more good news for the Premier League, and even more bad news for any of their rivals. The Premier League really is a league of its own at the moment when it comes to revenue and transfer fees and wages.
The Premier League with all this wealth, but still they do try to find ways of adjusting the regulations to maintain a semblance of competitive balance to prevent clubs just running away with it, even though we do had 5 titles out of 6 won by Manchester City. But there is a new cap, isn't there, in terms of wages to television revenue?
There's a proposal that in order to stop the clubs with the biggest revenues getting sort of bigger and bigger, and with the new Champions League money coming in, the new Club World Cup money coming in, there's a proposal which is being seriously considered by the clubs that the amount any club can spend on wages is anchored to what the bottom club gets in TV money. So, for example, Southampton will probably get about 105 million. So if they say the level is 4 times that, no club would be able to spend more than 420 million.
Does any club spend more than 420 million at the moment?
No, Manchester United, the biggest spenders and is 384 million. That's from the 2021-22 figures. That will give a bit of some flexibility for growth, but will put a cap on the total that can be spent. I suppose the only question is, does that put the Premier League at a disadvantage, the top clubs with its European rivals?
Well, Saudi rivals as well, when actually they're spending 100 million.
There's your competitor. It's the Premier League v Saudi Arabia. Isn't football great? I mean, that's the only place that's spending more on that scale than the Premier League.
Although Saudi Arabia, as we do say, does have a football heritage, it does have one of the most successful teams in Asia going back, so they do actually have every right to have a global league in that way.
Yeah, but no one says it. No one says it doesn't. And good luck.
Well, PSG and Barcelona both have had higher wage bills than that. So I know that some of the big clubs are against it. I think. So I think even like Arsenal and Spurs are not in favour of it, even though they have fairly low wages. But
why so? Why are they against it?
I'm not too sure, but
holding out for a takeover themselves that could allow them to have a sort of bigger wage bill.
Well, it doesn't matter to the current owners. Also, the sort of people who want to pay wages like that, I must say, don't sound like sensible owners. We hurtle from one side to the other about trying to make football more sustainable and sensible, And this idea of £420 million in the wage bill not being enough seems incredible.
And when we talk about sustainability with Manchester United at the top of the wage bill in the Premier League, perhaps the new Premier League rules that are coming in would have stopped that Glazers takeover all the way back in 2005. It's taken how many years to finally address the fan concerns about leverage takeovers, which we've also seen at Burnley as well, who are back in the Premier League now, but they were in the Premier League at the time that their leverage takeover was approved, 2.5 years ago.
Yeah, so this is a ban on fully leveraged buyouts, i.e. you can't take out the entire debt to cover the purchase of the club, which is effectively what the Glazers and ALK at Burnley. Now you're going to have to put in basically a third of the money yourself if you want to buy a club. That still leaves 2/3 that you can have as debt. Is that too much?
Yes, I'd say, because they're still, it's still against the club and it puts the club at risk. That just the ALK, the Burnley one, I think in some ways was even more egregious than the Manchester United one, because what they did, they took cash which was on Burnley's balance sheet out to pay the former owner. So essentially, Burnley paid from its own balance sheet for the right to be owned by ALK. Cash was taken out, given to the former owner, and as well as the debt. It was even worse in some ways than what the Glazers did. And I suppose Burnley fans are excited about being back in the Premier League and Vincent Kompany's new football, etc. But the ownership of Burnley and how it happened is still, a big stain on the league. And I guess that's why these regulations have come in.
But a big success of Burnley, relegating straight back up again with the new squad.
Yeah, and playing really good football. So well done to them for doing that. Does that mean we should have more of these sort of people who want to put no money in, borrow a load of money against the club because they might get them promoted? I'm not sure that's the right way of thinking.
And that also means that Burnley arriving back in the Premier League, that means at least one more club will be voting very strongly against getting rid of parachute payments.
There was a story, speaking of Burnley this week as well, guys, involving Everton. Martyn, you followed that quite closely, I think. Burnley is one of the clubs, and the three relegated clubs, Leeds United, Southampton and Leicester, lobbying the Premier League and threatening legal action against Everton and possibly even the Premier League over Everton's financial fair play alleged breaches. That could be a big issue rumbling in the next few months, couldn't it?
Yeah, it sounds like it's going to be October the 25th, the date where the Everton's profit and sustainability charge will be heard. And there is this sort of threat of legal action. I mean, I'm not quite sure how seriously to take that. I think some of these clubs sort of tend to do that as a matter of course, but it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because we knew with Sheffield United and Carlos Tevez and West Ham that they managed to get something like more than 20 million from West Ham.
That's right.
Court settlement.
I suppose also if they can find fault in the process somehow, say investigations weren't carried out at the right time, if they didn't rigorously enough pursue the case against Everton, that could be a grounds for rivals to try and mount action
against the Premier League as well. Yeah, it could get really, really messy. Martyn, you mentioned that date, October the 20th. So how comes? Here's a question for you: how comes they've figured out a date for the Everton hearing in front of that independent commission? The Manchester City case, which was announced much earlier than the Everton one, a few months ago. How come there is no date for that one? Why is the Everton one already got a fixed date?
Fixture congestion.
Probably 115 reasons why, Tariq, because there's one charge against Everton, very straightforward. There's 115 against Manchester City. And
so it could be 115 years then by that logic. The one charge takes a year for Everton. 115 will be how many league titles in that time?
Well, if you look back at the Derby and Sheffield Wednesday cases. I think they took between a year and a half, didn't they, in 2 years. They were fairly complicated. They were a lot more complicated than the Everton ones. There's all stuff around Derby's selling the stadium to the owner, selling the stadium to his own company, and things like that. They were quite complicated, but they were still, there were a handful of charges rather than 115, and they took a year and a half.
And Everton face potential points deductions. Here's a quiz question. We like these sometimes. Who are the only two clubs in the Premier League history, so since 1992, to be docked points?
I know one of them, Middlesbrough.
For?
They cancelled a match because they had all their players were sick.
Correcto.
What was the other one? I don't know what the other one was.
Portsmouth.
For going into administration.
Yes.
How we forget? Well, that must have been 13 years ago.
Yep. Last time Sheikh Mansour went to a football match. No. Yeah, around that time.
Where I've nearly managed to go all the episode without mentioning FIFA, but some big news about FIFA this week that surprisingly won't have generated that many headlines, but probably should have done. And it probably says as much about the person in the position as to why that is the case. Because after 7 years as the Secretary General of FIFA, Fatma Samoura is leaving. And we've barely talked about Fatma Samoura on the pod. It's not about Gianni Infantino, even though she effectively should be the chief executive with all the powers of running commercial and the operations at FIFA. But Gianni has seized that executive control that was never envisaged in the reforms after the FIFA scandals of 2015. And so Fatma Samoura has announced she's leaving at the end of the year.
New phone, who dis? I mean, really, who? She really left no mark on football, despite, I guess, the appointment is really important for a number of reasons, wasn't it? I mean, first woman to have such a senior role in football, someone from Africa as well, being placed in such an important role, and a Muslim person as well. So these three kind of big social reasons, it was kind of important that she was a real presence. But my abiding memory of Fatma Samoura's time in FIFA as the Secretary General would be her live tweeting football matches, I'm afraid, on her various platforms and various interesting places around the world, like globetrotting to different tournaments and hanging out at different places. And in terms of how she was used and deployed, only in some cases when you needed an attack dog for certain reasons. There was the case in Qatar on the eve of that first game when those European nations were planning to wear those armbands promoting human rights. It was Fatma Samoura who slapped them down. I think, threatening the Belgians at one point with, well, if you do this, what's stopping, the African nations from wearing armbands related to your colonial activities. That was when Gianni needed her as a force. She was deployed. But in terms of the roles you mentioned, Rob, the CEO of FIFA, nowhere to be seen in any of the big conversations.
I'm trying to think the last time FIFA allowed her to appear at a press conference, a general press conference, and take questions from the media.
I think that although we've seen it at some press conferences, I can't think of ever us being invited to one that's sort of an all-in global media press conference. Maybe ones in, for instance, Australia, New Zealand, some localized ones.
No, I remember.
Localized ones in Russia and
you were
Qatar.
There, Rob, right at the start. You were there as well, Martyn, right at the start. And I remember what it was about as well. It was at a Leaders in Football event at Chelsea, right at the start. And it was all about this new austere FIFA, how money won't be wasted, how they will be staying in cheaper hotels, how they will be flying normal planes or in normal seats like everybody else. But that's the last time there was something like that. What have we seen?
Can I actually remind you when it was? I think it was Soccer X in September 2016. And I believe it was the day or the morning after I'd done the report about FIFA disbanding its anti-racism committee, declaring effectively the mission was done. So I remember FIFA that day were trying to push back against that. And yeah, I think Fatma did sit down with us for quite some time, talking about her journey. And I suppose that's the thing, a lot of time we only heard about her journey, and yes, trailblazing in many ways. And FIFA statement did recognise, marking her departure, that she's helped to, I think, address some of the financial issues in terms of how money's distributed, and she's taken sort of oversight of that. But we've rarely seen her front of centre actually talking about these things and what she's doing in the job, and how much is that FIFA themselves not putting her out in public to talk about that and putting it all on Gianni Infantino.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of financial distribution, you mentioned, Rob, it's also important to point out in the time she's been in office since 2016, those 7 years, she's the second highest paid employee of FIFA. You know, the amount that she will have earned would be perhaps in the double-digit millions now of dollars as she departs, former UN official.
All publicly available figures
Yeah,
from FIFA.
they're all there. But then you think, God, in terms of delivery, in terms of what did you do, it's not a bad job to get if anyone's up for it, is it? Looks like you don't really have to do much.
But she has been in Australia, New Zealand, overseeing all those preparations for the Women's World Cup.
Well, no, not really. I think she's just arrived in New Zealand in the last few weeks. Those organisations and the planning for that, I think she's belatedly been involved in. And I saw in the statement that was released to announce her exit, she said this was decided months ago, and it was on Gianni's invitation to oversee the organising of the Australia and New Zealand World Cup that she's decided to stay. But if you talk to organisers of the event, both in Australia and New Zealand, I think they might tell you she hasn't been that involved.
I mean, one thing is as well, things like the annual IFA press conferences where we got used to Jerome Valcker's Secretary General appearing at those, going on the record. Perhaps we could say it's better that Gianni Infantino is front and centre because it's a chance to ask questions. But she wasn't sort of ever given that platform alongside Gianni Infantino at those big set-piece press conferences.
No, not at all. And I think the number of times we spoke to Jerome Valcke over the years, certainly in the 7 years before Fatma Samoura was appointed, spoke to him. He was there all the time. He would be at press conferences with Sepp Blatter. He would do things on his own. I don't know. I think FIFA. My guess is FIFA were worried that she might say the wrong thing or she wouldn't follow the party line, and they were not willing to give her the responsibility of speaking to the media in that sort of unrestrained way, which is a shame because I think FIFA's lost an opportunity to actually make an example of somebody who broke so many barriers when she was appointed. She could have taken a much bigger role than she actually did.
Also, Martyn, you mentioned responsibility. In terms of given responsibility, if she was the CEO or the Secretary General, which is effectively the CEO of FIFA, why are they asking her to oversee the organisation of the Women's World Cup in Australia and New Zealand and not the oversight and responsibility over the Men's World Cup in Qatar that took place in 2022? Because she was not a part of that process, or hardly a part of that process at all. Gianni Infantino, in fact, moved himself to Qatar, if you recall, and had a team there. Again, it also speaks to their, in a way, like, are they taking the Women's World Cup as seriously as the Men's World Cup or not? Because if they were, surely the CEO should have been in charge or had this oversight role of both of them. What? Because she is a woman, she should oversee the Women's World Cup? I'm really confused as to some of the decision making here.
And you could argue that the Men's World Cup is just purely more financially important to the organisation. There's more risk involved if there was anything going wrong with it. So the fiduciary duty to the company, the business, the organisation would be at the Men's World Cup in Qatar, while also trying to grow the Women's World Cup. Although this week we finally have a breakthrough on the Women's World Cup TV rights in Europe, which was always clearly going to happen. There was never going to be a blackout in Europe. And FIFA have announced the the new deal. No sense that they've actually managed to extract more money. I think just a commitment for some more hourly weekly
An hour a
broadcasts
week.
of women's football.
Yeah, it seems like a sort of face-saving exercise. Of course, they were never going to have a blackout because that would be cutting off your nose to spite your face, wouldn't it? So I think most of the broadcasters held firm. Certainly the BBC, ITV thought they'd done a deal in November, and from what I understand, that hasn't really moved. So I still feel some sort of empathy with that FIFA's position that the broadcasters weren't, were just taking the opportunity to offer sort of ridiculously low sums, especially in Italy, for example, less than £1 million. But on the other hand, has this been a bit of a sort of diversion away from building up to the tournament?
Absolutely. I mean, that's a really good point as well. Had the rights been delivered earlier, those who hold the rights now could start their campaigns to build interest in the Women's World Cup, which, let's not forget, is still a growing tournament. We still want people to get interested in women's football, and we've lost months of that now.
The Women's World Cup starting on July the 20th in Australia and New Zealand. Before we do wrap up, returning to that seismic story from last week, that the repercussions are still being felt from the effective takeover of global golf by the Public Investment Fund of Saudi Arabia. And what about those players who were told to reject the Live Golf offers, the hundreds of millions in some cases, told to stay loyal, and now having seen their own boss, the PGA Tour leadership, going into bed with the Live Golf and PIF?
Yeah, this was referred to by Rory McIlroy last week. He was asked, should there be some sort of way that those players who stayed loyal get equivalent financial rewards as those who left for Live Golf, and he said yes. And so it now emerges that the Saudi Public Investment Fund, PIF, who are going to bankroll this new joint venture, are planning to set up a fund, a sort of a levelling up fund, effectively, where those top players who sort of missed out on the cash will get a big payday.
No one likes setting up a fund as much as the Saudis do, Martyn. Any idea how much more? It almost seems like money is no object, but in order to sort of level this out, there are a lot of players on that PGA Tour. I mean, are we talking billions?
I think it would probably have to be in the region of $1 billion. Because if you think Phil Mickelson alone got $200 million, then maybe more than $1 billion. But as you say, it's the total is probably fairly meaningless to the Saudis if they get control. The other thing is it looks like the end for Live Golf. I think it's going to all be wrapped up by the end of the year. This sort of team competition. I think they are going to have some sort of lower key team event. But the end for Greg Norman. One other thing just to leave you with, I think it's quite important, don't you think, that Jay Monahan, the commissioner of the PGA Tour, Keith Pelley, the head of the European Tour, that they be very transparent about what they, if anything, are getting paid themselves for this joint venture?
This week, Jay Monahan, the PGA Tour commissioner, announcing he's stepping away from the day-to-day running of the tour to recuperate.
Yeah, he suffered a serious illness of some kind. I mean, it must have been a very stressful few weeks for Jay Monahan. But in terms of that transparency, you're right, Martyn. We might get to see some of that because a Senate committee in the United States has asked to review how that deal went down and might get access to conversations, messages, and documents related to that. So watch this space.
Watch this space. Listen to this space too.
Indeed, it's been great being with you guys again.
Thank you, everyone, for listening. As ever, you can message us at Sport Unlocked on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And if you're enjoying us, hit subscribe as well, please. Now, goodbye.